The morning sun bathed Prague in gold, glinting off the cobblestones of the Charles Bridge and turning the Vltava River into a ribbon of molten silver. The city's spires reached toward the sky, and its narrow alleys echoed with the voices of merchants calling their wares, the clatter of horses' hooves, and the laughter of children playing near the riverbanks. To any passer-by, it was a city of order and commerce, a jewel in the crown of Bohemia. Yet beneath this veneer of normalcy, Prague simmered with quiet fury. The streets carried whispers of injustice, rumors of secret decrees, and tales of faith denied. Here the air was heavy, not with smoke or incense, but with the tension of a populace who had grown accustomed to the fragile balance of religion and politics. The Protestant nobility, guardians of centuries-old privileges and rights, had tolerated the Habsburgs' rule only because they had until now respected the Letter of Majesty, a charter guaranteeing freedom of worship for the kingdom's diverse confessions. But that charter was crumbling. Ferdinand of Styria, the newly appointed heir to the throne, had arrived in Prague with the heavy certainty of a Jesuit education and the iron resolve of a devout Catholic. Where Matthias, the aging emperor, had ruled with caution, Ferdinand brought ambition cloaked in orthodoxy. He saw the Protestant churches and assemblies not as communities of faith, but as defiance to be corrected, their liberties exceptions to be revoked. The Protestant nobility had watched in growing alarm as royal officials, emboldened by Ferdinand's vision, began to infringe upon sacred rights. Orders came down to cease the construction of Protestant chapels on royal lands. Worshippers were questioned, priests intimidated, and the possibility of punishment loomed like a shadow over every gathering. For decades, Bohemia had been a patchwork of faiths: Hussites, Lutherans, Calvinists, and Catholics coexisting under a tenuous covenant. That covenant now threatened to dissolve, leaving only anger in its wake. Among the disquieted nobles, Heinrich Matthias Thurn rose as both a voice and a symbol. A man of conviction and calculated courage, he recognized the danger before others did. He knew that inaction would be interpreted as submission, and that submission could cost both faith and life. By mid-June, the protests had begun, first in muted assemblies, then in guarded letters, and finally in secret councils behind closed doors. Plans were whispered across Prague's courtyards. Strategies were formed over hushed conversations in taverns. The air was charged, as if the city itself sensed the approaching storm. Meanwhile, inside the imposing walls of Hradčany Castle, imperial officials, Jaroslav Bořita of Martinice, Vilém Slavata of Chlum, and Adam of Sternberg, went about their morning routines unaware of the swelling unrest. Their offices overlooked the courtyard, and their windows framed the serene city beyond. Yet serenity in Prague was an illusion. Every step in the courtyard echoed the unspoken question: how long before peace fractured? The three men, steeped in tradition and loyalty to the emperor, could not perceive that their world was about to collapse. Not with thunder, nor with siege engines, but with the simple, shocking act of a thrown body. Outside the castle, the crowd gathered. Nobles armed with swords and conviction moved alongside commoners whose faith had long been tested by political whims. Their faces were set, their eyes alight with a mixture of fear and resolve. As they crossed the Charles Bridge, the city seemed to hold its breath, the sound of boots against stone amplified by anticipation. This was no ordinary protest. It was the culmination of decades of simmering tension, a singular defiant response to what was perceived as the first breach of sacred trust. Yet even in this moment of impending violence, There was a strange quiet. Birds circled above the castle, oblivious to human scheming. The river flowed with gentle persistence, as if mocking the passions of men. And in that quiet, the moral weight of the coming act hung heavily. These men, who would soon face the abyss, were defenders of faith in the eyes of some, criminals in the eyes of others. History would judge them differently, but on that morning, judgment had not yet descended. The tension inside the council chamber was palpable. The nobles who had made their way into the castle moved like shadows, their movements deliberate, controlled. They carried not only weapons, but the weight of conscience and conviction. For them, this confrontation was inevitable, an unavoidable reckoning with the authority that had betrayed the sacred guarantees of the Bohemian people. And so, as the clock neared the fatal hour, Prague stood poised on the edge of catastrophe. One more decision, one more gesture, would ignite a chain of events that would not only shatter the calm of the city, but also plunge Europe into decades of war. Below the castle walls, the Vltava sparkled, the morning sun painting the waters in gold and silver. Above, the castle towers gleamed, indifferent to the human drama about to unfold. And in the air between, a storm of faith, fear, and fury was gathering, ready to hurl 3 men from the windows of history and into legend. The first noble stepped forward, the weight of centuries on his shoulders, and the city seemed to hold its breath. The massive doors of Hradčany Castle groaned as Heinrich Matthias Thurn and his companions stepped into the council chamber. Their boots echoed across the marble floor, a somber percussion that seemed to drum the rhythm of destiny. Jaroslav Bořita of Martinice, Vilém Slavata, and Adam of Sternberg looked up from their papers, startled by the intrusion. Their expressions flickered between confusion and restrained panic, for they had been told of unrest in the city, but never of an armed assembly storming the very heart of imperial authority. Thurn's voice, calm but laden with authority, cut through the chamber. You have violated the Letter of Majesty. You have turned law into tyranny. You have betrayed the faith of our people. The noble's accusation hung in the air like smoke from a long smoldering fire. The officials attempted to respond, but their words faltered, trapped by fear and the sudden awareness that they were surrounded by men who no longer feared consequence. Appeals to the emperor were suggested, a delay tactic, yet it was already too late. The crowd outside the castle's walls pressed in, a living pressure that seeped into the chamber. Every second of hesitation made the chamber feel smaller, the walls closer, as if history itself were bending the room into inevitability. Then the first act of violence erupted. Martinice felt hands on his shoulders, strong and unyielding, lifting him toward the open window that overlooked the courtyard 70 feet below. His protests were drowned in a chorus of cries, prayers to God, invocations of the Virgin Mary, and shouted vows of justice. The nobles' devotion fueled their wrath, and in one terrifying instant, Martinice was hurled into the void. The fall seemed endless. For those in the chamber, time fractured, stretched into horror. Outside, a collective gasp rippled through the assembly and the crowd below. The body struck the ground not with fatal thud, but with a muted impact, the result of a mound of refuse and construction debris, a grim, accidental cushion. Martinice groaned, pain coursing through him, yet alive. The crowd's roar turned to a mix of disbelief and elation. Fate had smiled, or so it seemed. Vilém Slavata was next. As he approached the window, he made the sign of the cross, his lips moving in silent prayer. His fingers clutched the sill for a moment, desperately seeking purchase, but the hands of the Protestant nobles forced him forward. A dagger's hilt struck his fingers, sending him tumbling in a cruel, chaotic arc. He hit the lower ledge, and then the ground, unconscious but breathing. Around him, the air throbbed with tension. The chamber had become a theater of divine judgment and human fury. Adam of Sternberg, though initially spared, witnessed the ordeal in silent horror. Nearby, the secretary Philip Fabricius was also seized, his frame tossed with terrifying precision. The courtyard below became a tableau of human survival against incredible odds. All three men would live, a near miraculous defiance of death that would be whispered about for decades. The so-called angels, the providential debris, the uncertain mercy of God. As the dust settled, the chamber became a maelstrom of movement and noise. Fabricius scrambled to his feet and fled, determined to report the events to Emperor Matthias in Vienna. Slavata remained unconscious, his fate temporarily suspended, while Martinice clung to life amid the rubble, his injuries minor by fortune rather than skill. Thurn's assembly quickly dispersed, the tension in the air still crackling with the threat of escalation. Beyond the castle, Prague itself stirred like a living entity. Citizens pressed to windows and doorways, watching the aftermath of defiance and daring. The news spread like wildfire through the alleys, marketplaces, and taverns. Imperial officials had been thrown from the windows. The symbolism of the act, faith defying authority, courage challenging oppression, ignited an energy that had been building for decades. Yet even as the city erupted, the moral weight of the act lingered. The Protestants had acted in what they believed to be righteous defense of religious freedom, but the line between justice and vengeance had blurred. They had risked committing murder to enforce liberty, and in doing so, had summoned forces far beyond their comprehension. This was no longer a dispute of local governance. It had become a declaration of war. In the following hours, Prague became a city transformed. Royal authority faltered, the Habsburgs' grip loosened, and noble houses took sides. The air was thick with anticipation and fear. Rumors of counterattacks and imperial retribution rippled like unseen currents through every street. The Vltava carried whispers of revolt as the first embers of the Bohemian uprising ignited, signaling a conflict that would not remain contained within the city walls. By evening, the initial shock of survival had faded, replaced by the grim realization that the defenestration had irrevocably altered the course of European history. Bohemia was now a powder keg, and the sparks had been cast with deliberate precision. The Protestant nobility had struck, and the empire could not ignore it. The first movement in what would become the 30 Years' War had been played, and the consequences would stretch across the continent. Armies would march, alliances would crumble, cities would burn, and faith would become both a banner and a weapon. Prague, once serene in the morning sun, now simmered with rebellion, its streets echoing with the cries of those who had borne witness. Above the city, the castle windows that had witnessed the fall remained open, silent, yet accusatory, like eyes staring down from the past. And below, in the courtyard, the three men who had survived the impossible act lay battered and shaken, living testaments to a violent resolve that history would remember forever. As night fell over the city, the Vltava reflected the darkening sky, and the shadow of war stretched over Prague. No longer a mere city of commerce and religion, it had become the epicenter of rebellion, the birthplace of a conflict that would engulf Europe in fire and blood. The defenestration was only the beginning. The echoes of shattered glass and the cries from Hradčany Castle still resonated through Prague when the city's leaders began to grasp the magnitude of what had occurred. The defenestration was not merely an act of violence. It was a declaration. It signaled the refusal of Bohemia to remain under the tightening grip of a Habsburg monarchy that threatened to erase the freedoms secured decades earlier. The Protestant nobility moved quickly to consolidate power. Meetings were held in secret chambers, in candlelit halls, and in the quiet corners of Prague's courtyards. Decisions were made with urgency, for every moment of hesitation risked imperial reprisal. It was within this whirlwind of strategy and fear that Frederick V of the Palatinate emerged as a symbol of resistance. Young, ambitious, and Protestant, Frederick had already earned a reputation as a capable ruler and military leader. When the Bohemian estates offered him the crown, he accepted, aware that his choice would ignite a conflict far larger than Bohemia itself. On August 26, 1619, Frederick was crowned King of Bohemia, his title echoing across the kingdom like a clarion call of defiance. He was immediately dubbed the Winter King, a moniker that would prove tragically prophetic, for his reign lasted barely a season before the Habsburg forces struck back. Yet at the moment of his coronation, hope surged through the Protestant nobility. They believed that by installing a ruler of their own faith, they could secure the religious freedoms they had long fought to preserve. But the defiance of Prague did not remain isolated. News traveled swiftly, carried by messengers, traders, and the flow of the Vltava itself. Across Bohemia, cities and towns began to rise in support, or at least in cautious alignment with the revolt. Lutheran, Calvinist, and Hussite communities sent reinforcements, supplies, and pledges of allegiance. Even some disillusioned Catholic nobles questioned the wisdom of Habsburg absolutism, fearing that the crown's rigidity could invite catastrophe. The Habsburg response was swift and uncompromising. Emperor Matthias, though aged and infirm, called upon the resources of his vast empire. Troops were mobilized from across Austria and Hungary, and orders were dispatched to quell the uprising before it could spread beyond Bohemia's borders. Yet the defenestration had already unleashed forces that no imperial command could fully contain. The conflict quickly expanded from a local revolt into a confrontation that drew in the principal powers of Europe. Spain, under the Catholic Habsburgs, prepared to support Ferdinand of Styria. France, wary of Habsburg dominance yet committed to its own strategic interests, began to weigh its position. Protestant states in the Holy Roman Empire, particularly the Palatinate, mobilized in defense of Frederick and the Bohemian estates. The intricate web of alliances and rivalries, already fragile, began to snap under the strain. What had begun as a religious protest against the infringement of local rights now threatened to engulf the continent. Amid the political maneuvering, the human cost began to mount. Battles, sieges, and skirmishes erupted across Bohemia. Families fled their homes, monasteries were looted, and villages caught between advancing armies faced starvation and devastation. The moral weight of rebellion, once a principled stand for faith and liberty, now intertwined with the horrors of war, betrayal, pillage, and the indiscriminate suffering of the innocent. The nobles who had thrown officials from Hradčany Castle had set in motion a chain of violence that no single conscience could control. Even as Frederick assumed the crown, doubts lingered among his advisors. Could a ruler, so young and untested, withstand the might of the Habsburg dynasty? Could the fragile alliances forged in the shadow of defenestration hold under the pressure of continental war. Prague, which had witnessed the miraculous survival of 3 men thrown from a window, now braced itself for a far graver test: survival in a Europe increasingly defined by the clash of faith, ambition, and power. By the winter of 1619, it was clear that the defenestration had become far more than a local incident. It had ignited a struggle that would last decades, drawing in Spain, France, Sweden, the Dutch Republic, and countless principalities of the Holy Roman Empire. The lines between political ambition and religious conviction blurred, and the moral certainties that had guided Bohemian nobles into the castle chamber that June morning were replaced by the unpredictable chaos of international conflict. Prague had thrown men from a window, and in doing so, it had thrown Europe into a maelstrom. Armies would march, cities would burn, and the concept of peace itself would be tested in ways unimaginable. Yet amidst the looming catastrophe, the citizens of Bohemia clung to hope. A hope that faith, courage, and unity could withstand the coming storm. And yet, even as the winter winds swept across Prague, a darker truth settled over the city. The revolt that had begun as a principled stand against oppression was about to become a war that no one could control. A war that would leave the continent scarred for a generation. The first shots of the 30 Years' War had been fired, not with cannons or muskets, but from a window overlooking a courtyard, and the world was about to learn just how far those shots would travel. Bohemia's defiance had lit a fire that could not be contained. By 1620, the conflict had expanded far beyond Prague, reaching into the heartlands of the Holy Roman Empire and drawing in kingdoms across Europe. The 30 Years' War, as it would come to be known, was not merely a struggle of armies, but a collision of ideologies, ambitions, and faiths that would reshape the continent. The Habsburgs, seeking to reassert authority, assembled an army of disciplined mercenaries and loyal troops from Austria, Hungary, and Spain. They marched with grim determination, their banners proclaiming the emperor's divine right and the Catholic cause. Opposing them, Frederick V and the Bohemian estates mustered what forces they could: local militias, mercenary companies, and allies from Protestant states across the empire. The battlefield became a theater where religion and politics were inseparable, and every village, town, and city could be transformed into a trap or a sanctuary. The Battle of White Mountain, fought near Prague in November 1620, became the grim centerpiece of the early war. Imperial forces, seasoned and disciplined, crushed the Bohemian army in a matter of hours. Frederick's hopes, once bright with the promise of a new Protestant kingdom, were extinguished under a canopy of smoke and blood. Thousands of soldiers fell, and the defeated nobility fled into exile. The winter winds carried not only the chill of November, but also the despair of a crushed rebellion. Yet the war did not end there. It spread like wildfire. Spain intervened to support the Habsburgs, seeking to secure its European holdings and reinforce Catholic dominance. France, wary of Habsburg hegemony, maneuvered cautiously, providing support to Protestant states when advantageous. Sweden, under the leadership of Gustavus Adolphus, would later cross the Baltic with a disciplined army, determined to defend Protestant interests and expand influence in Northern Europe. The Netherlands, embroiled in their struggle against Spain, became another theater in which religious and political ambitions intertwined. Everywhere the armies marched, the war left a trail of suffering. Villages were burned, crops destroyed, and civilians forced into flight. Disease and famine spread through the refugee populations, claiming more lives than the battlefield itself. Towns like Magdeburg and Bamberg became notorious for massacres and sieges, where soldiers and mercenaries, acting with little restraint, slaughtered indiscriminately. Faith and loyalty offered no protection. A Catholic peasant could be executed by a Protestant soldier, a Lutheran merchant's family massacred by imperial troops. The war's cruelty was a reflection of the moral ambiguity that had begun in Prague. Acts once deemed righteous became instruments of terror and oppression. The conflict also forced unprecedented diplomatic entanglements. Treaties were signed and broken. Alliances shifted with alarming frequency, and each new ruler or general brought fresh strategies and new brutalities. The war blurred the line between political necessity and religious zealotry, making it nearly impossible for ordinary people to discern friend from foe. The devastation was systemic. Economies collapsed, trade routes disappeared, and entire regions were depopulated. Children grew up knowing nothing but violence, and the survivors carried the scars, physical, emotional, and spiritual, for generations. Amid the chaos, stories of individual heroism persisted, though always shadowed by tragedy. Some soldiers risked their lives to protect civilians, while some nobles shielded peasants from pillage. Yet these acts were often fleeting and fragile. Outnumbered by the relentless cruelty of war, faith became both shield and sword. Prayers were whispered over dying comrades, even as cities burned in the distance. The moral weight of human action, whether noble or monstrous, was magnified by the scale of suffering. As the war spread, the once local dispute in Prague became a template for violence across Europe. The Defenestration, which had seemed a dramatic but isolated act, revealed its true historical significance. A spark that ignited decades of conflict, reshaped political boundaries, and tested the moral and spiritual resilience of an entire continent. Nations would rise and fall, armies would gain and lose fortunes, and ordinary people would endure the unrelenting horrors that accompany war. By the mid-1620s, Europe was a continent in flames. No corner was untouched, no population untouched by famine, disease, or violence. The 30 Years' War had begun as a struggle of faith and privilege in Prague, and had expanded into a struggle for survival, sovereignty, and supremacy that would not end for decades. And still, amidst the blood and chaos, the question lingered. Could humanity endure such a prolonged ordeal, or had the defenestration of a single window set into motion a human tragedy beyond measure? Prague, once the serene jewel of Bohemia, remained a city haunted by its own history. The Hradčany windows, through which 3 men had survived the fall, became a symbol not only of daring and defiance, but of consequences unforeseen. The act had ignited a war that would claim millions of lives and redraw the map of Europe, a reminder that even the smallest actions can have echoes far beyond imagination. And across the continent, as armies prepared for the next campaign, Europe waited with bated breath, knowing that the horrors yet to come would eclipse anything that had already unfolded. Europe emerged from the 30 Years' War changed forever. What had begun as a defiance in Prague, a violent assertion of religious and political rights, left a continent scarred by famine, disease, and depopulation. In some regions of the Holy Roman Empire, the population decreased by 1/3. Towns became ghostly shells, and entire regions bore silent testimony to the human cost of prolonged conflict. Fields lay fallow, commerce faltered, and the once thriving cities of Central Europe whispered with the echoes of absent voices. Religious transformations reshaped society. Protestant and Catholic communities had fought for dominance, yet the ultimate resolution came not through victory or annihilation, but through compromise. The Peace of Westphalia in 1648 formalized a new political order. The sovereignty of states was recognized, religious tolerance expanded, and the principle of non-interference in domestic affairs became a cornerstone of international law. For the first time, Europe acknowledged that local disputes could not always be settled by force alone, and that political stability required negotiation, not coercion. The consequences of the war were not confined to laws and treaties. The social fabric of Europe was forever altered. Peasants who survived famine and pillage returned to shattered villages. Nobles who had raised armies faced ruin, their titles and wealth diminished by the relentless drain of decades-long warfare. Families were fragmented, communities displaced, and the psychological toll endured across generations. Yet even amid this devastation, human resilience endured. Churches were rebuilt, markets reopened, and cities like Prague began to reclaim their place as cultural and economic centers, though forever shadowed by memory. The moral weight of the conflict remained profound. The act that ignited the war, a window through which 3 men were thrown, illustrated the paradoxical nature of history. Courage, conviction, and the defense of faith collided with hubris, vengeance, and unintended consequences. The Bohemian nobles had acted with righteous purpose, yet their defiance unleashed destruction far beyond what they could have imagined. The survival of Martinice, Slavata, and Fabricius became legend, a miraculous story woven into the fabric of European memory, but it could not undo the suffering that followed. Beyond Bohemia, the war reshaped the political map of Europe. The Habsburgs retained power, but their dominance was curtailed. France emerged strengthened, while Sweden gained influence in northern Europe. The Dutch Republic secured its independence and consolidated its role as a maritime and commercial power. Boundaries were redrawn, and the principle of state sovereignty gained unprecedented recognition, laying the groundwork for the modern international order. In this sense, the defenestration of a single castle window echoed through centuries, illustrating how localized acts of defiance can ripple outward to reshape entire civilizations. Culturally and psychologically, Europe was transformed. Writers, philosophers, and chroniclers recorded the horrors and heroics of the war. Accounts of massacres, famine, and miracles circulated widely, creating a collective memory of endurance and tragedy. Religious tolerance became a necessity, not a mere ideal, and the lessons of Bohemia reminded rulers and citizens alike that faith, while powerful, could never justify unrestrained violence without consequences. In Prague, the windows of Hradčany Castle still overlooked the courtyard where history had pivoted. Tourists, scholars, and citizens in later centuries would gaze upon those stones, unaware that centuries earlier, 3 men had fallen and survived. The city had become a living monument to courage and catastrophe, a reminder that history is rarely neat and that the smallest acts can ignite forces far beyond comprehension. Ultimately, the Defenestration of Prague stands as a testament to the intertwined forces of human ambition, conviction, and folly. A single morning in 1618 transformed local grievance into a continental conflagration, illuminating the fragility of peace and the unpredictability of history. Lives were lost and preserved. Nations were challenged and reshaped, and the moral complexities of rebellion and authority would echo in the conscience of Europe for generations. Prague's skyline remains, its towers still catching the sun as they did in 1618, yet beneath the beauty lies the shadow of that moment. a window through which 3 men fell, a city that rose in defiance, and a Europe forever changed. The defenestration was not merely an act of violence. It was a spark that illuminated the power of human choice, for better or worse, and the enduring truth that history is written as much in daring leaps as in measured steps.